Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast, the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. This week, we're concluding our series on gender and sexuality with an interview with a couple from my church named Jim and Richard. Very excited for you to hear their story. And if you have any comments or encouragement for them, you can always do that at the show notes at irenicast.com/14 for this episode. And just a quick note before we get into the interview, if over the next couple weeks you find that your episodes aren't downloading like they normally do, we're going to be doing some technical stuff behind the scenes with our feed. We don't anticipate there being a problem, but therefore, if there is, know that you can always just unsubscribe and resubscribe, and that should reset everything and fix it. But again, probably won't be an issue. But if you do have any complications, you can always email the podcast at podcast@irenicast.com. So thank you for checking us out this week. If you enjoy what you hear, you can help support the podcast by going to iTunes and Stitcher to rate, review, and subscribe. Your ratings and reviews really help the show, so we appreciate that. And then also you can leave your questions and feedback by following us on Twitter or going to Google+. And now you can leave a voice message on irenicast.com/feedback. So I will shut up and we'll get right into the interview on the other side of the music. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. We have a special interview for you as a close to our series of podcasts on gender and sexuality. And I have with me today two of my most favorite people in the world, Jim and Richard. Hello, guys. How's it going?
Hi.
Going pretty well.
Doing well.
Good. Why don't you go ahead and say your name and a little bit about yourself to kind of get started so people can associate the name with your voice?
Okay. I'm Richard. What do I say? I'm 67 years old. I've been in the Methodist Church off and on for the last 40 plus years. Actually, I was raised as a Methodist. And therein lies part of our conversation.
And I'm Jim, and I joined the Methodist Church when I was about 16 and have been a Methodist off and on, depending on where I was in life and in the service and in the world. And am now a member of the Methodist Church where I first became a Methodist, and like the congregation, it's a very open and accepting church, although I'm not so satisfied with the denomination.
And we'll for sure get into that aspect of it, but first let's just kind of start with a little bit of your story. So Richard, why don't you start with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your family, your upbringing, and then kind of into when you realized you were gay and what your coming out process was like?
I was raised in the Midwest, very, very stable Midwest average family, I would think, of 6 kids. I was the youngest of 6. Was raised in the church some of my siblings and my father never went to church, but my mother and I went. And that's where I found a love for all things churchy and the United Methodist Church, and didn't know I was beginning a love-hate relationship with the church, but obviously I was. The thing that has me so perplexed and so maybe aggravated with the United Methodist Church is that it's taken 40 years and homosexuals and transgendered people are still considered less than in the United Methodist Church. And I'm working at this church, Trinity United Methodist Church. I am the head of the Reconciling Ministries Committee and working to change that in the United Methodist Church.
Jim, how about you?
Well, before coming to the Methodist Church, in my youth, I was raised in a very fundamentalist church, and I guess they'd call it an evangelical church now. And then the Methodist Church, my outlook was challenged, my beliefs were challenged, and I began to look at things differently. But as for being gay, I think I knew that all along, but it was something I didn't let myself think about because I had a lot of baggage and risking God's punishment if you even thought those thoughts. But finally, in my late 20s, 30s, early 30s, I finally came out, and I came out to my parents, to my mother, who was troubled by it but dealt with it, and my family has been supportive through the years. And I've really been lucky in a way. Places where I've worked, some people knew, some people didn't, and those who knew were fairly supportive. The church, I drifted away from the church because there was a lot of rejection there. And then when I was living in St. Louis, I met a priest, and we would have dinner, and he had suggested at one point, he asked if I missed the church, and I said that I did. And he recommended a Methodist church in St. Louis that I go to, Lafayette Park Methodist. And that's where I met Richard. And then the rest is just sort of history from there.
So, Jim, was the break that you had from the church, how long of a time was that?
15 years at least 15 years. I was mad at God. I was mad at the church. I was just generally angry. And then I walked into Lafayette Park Church on that Sunday, and it was like the music, the hymns, the scriptures, the sermon, everything had been planned because I was coming. It was just one of those moments. Mm-hmm. And so then I had talks with the minister, and then got back involved in the church. It was a very open and accepting church. And later became a reconciling congregation. It was the first one in St. Louis of the Methodist churches there.
And then, Richard, how about you? How was that process for you? Did you have a lapse time from the church as well, or?
My lapse time was about 15 years also. Okay. I was so angry. The United Methodist Conference in Missouri at that time had put out an ultimatum, or that no gay people shall hold any kind of office in the churches, will not teach Sunday school in the churches. At that time, I was teaching Sunday school to little ones, and just thoroughly enjoying what I was doing, mm-hmm. Loving it. And I just got so angry and so hurt, and was so bitter at that, because prejudice has never been a part of my being. Any kind of prejudice, I just don't understand it, and I just could not, and still cannot understand why the church feels the way the church feels about gay people. Back to, if I may, my story, my coming out, and that thing. I think I finally, or first realized that I was gay and didn't know what to call it when I was probably 5 years old. I remember one of my oldest brother was 14 years older than I, and I was probably 5 at the time, so he would have been 19, around 19, 20, he and his friends. And one of his friends would always come in, and he would pick me up, just say, "Hi, how are you?" They would come into the house. And I remember looking at him one day, and just looking at his face, looking at his lips, and thinking, I wonder what it would be like to kiss him. Now, where that came from a child that age, I have no idea. Of course, none of us have any idea. But I think that was my first inkling that something was not, quote unquote, the norm with mm-hmm. myself. And then as I grew and finally into puberty, I realized that I was gay. There was no dramatic coming out. I didn't sit anybody down and say, I'm gay. Well, I did. I take that back. There was one friend who had known my whole life that I was gay, but didn't tell me. But I never sat my family down and said. It was just kind of because my family never really talked about things, as it were. So it was just kind of a gradual, and some of them took it well, and some of them didn't take it so well. So that's just life.
So did either of you have a time where you just felt, where you had accepted it within yourself? You knew what you were, but you had like a hiding period where you felt you had to be someone else around people or family or friends. And then how was that experience like if you had that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Uh, sure, living in a small town of 500 people in a rural southern Illinois town, yes, you hide. You don't, you let your dearest friends maybe know something,
Hmm.
uh, but yeah, you don't. You hide is what you do. That's about the only way to survive in that environment.
Hmm. Jim, how about you?
Well, I was married and had a daughter and a stepson when I came out, and so there were a lot of problems to be overcome. But in the divorce, I also had custody of the children. My wife at the time told the courts and everyone that she thought I would be a better parent. And so that was a remarkable experience to be dealing with your own sexuality and getting comfortable with that and raising two children. But we got through it, and we're all years later relatively well adjusted. But it was very difficult. And the only one of the things that made it survivable was that my stepson was older than my daughter, and he had gone on and was out on his own. And my daughter had some psychological problems stemming from the divorce. And so she had to have counseling, and I had counseling as part of her counseling. And so I was able to talk with a psychologist about all of it, and that really helped a lot because he was very supportive. My daughter had no problems. She's always been supportive. We have a very good relationship. But it was difficult. In the Midwest, where it's rather conservative, you have to be very careful. It can mean your job, you know. So being responsible for someone other than myself, it was really very necessary that I be very careful about who I shared my story with.
Hmm.
And that all happened before Jim and I met. At that time, when he was dealing with that, I was dealing with my first partner, who subsequently died of AIDS.
Hmm.
So we both have had our rough spots.
Mm-hmm. So both of you had a 15-year gap from the church, and both of you talked about this idea that you were angry and upset. What were you upset about? What did you miss? Like, I don't know if there's a way to describe those feelings and specific instances that highlighted those feelings.
For me, what made me angry was that I knew who I was, but people being the church just turned their back.
Hmm.
You know, people that I had known who had been friends, who I'd done things with. When word got around the church like wildfire, doors closed, phone calls didn't happen, people turned their backs. And that I had the children made it even worse because people didn't want to support that. I mean, a gay man raising children, that was just where I lived. That was in West Texas at the time. And that just flew in the face of everything that people knew to be right and good. And so I was pretty much on my own. And then by the time I was in St. Louis, my daughter went through her counseling there, and then she graduated from high school, and she moved back to Texas from St. Louis and was on her own. So then I was on my own, and that's how I gravitated back to, met that priest, and then he suggested Lafayette Park Church. I ended up there. I met Richard and got re-involved in the church.
So during that time, where was your community? Did you find support in another group, or did you just feel as though I'm in this alone and I just got to get through and raise my kids?
That was pretty much it. I really didn't have a community. I had a few friends, less than 5 probably, that I could consider close friends. So I was just pretty much on my own. You have 2 or 3 and that's it. So, and it was a real struggle. There were a couple of low periods where I just thought, do I really need to keep putting up with this or not? But I did, and I'm certainly glad that I did.
I am too. Richard, how about you? Did you have that? Did you find a new community, or was there a period of loneliness, or how did that process look like for you?
There was a period of loneliness. The church, Lafayette Park Church, that Jim and I both went to, was a wonderful church. I mean, they were so supportive. We had an AIDS ministry. It was a great place to be. Uh, that being said, there's always the 2:30 or 3 o'clocks in the mornings when you wake up and there's nobody there, and all those friends who have said, if you need me, call me. You're not going to call them at 2:30 in the morning. You really want to. And what happened with me was after I lost my first partner, that set of friends just kind of went away. Just kind of, you know, didn't call, didn't come by. I would call, they wouldn't be there, they were busy, or that. And I think that happens no matter who you are. When someone loses a spouse, a partner, the friends tend to go away, maybe because they don't know what to say, or just don't want you around anymore, or hey, are you hitting on my are you hitting on my spouse now that you're single?
Wow.
But yeah, there was some very, very lonely times, and where I was working was a warehouse setting, and you don't share with the gang in the warehouse that you just lost your husband,
Yeah.
through AIDS. You hide it. As they say, you buck up and you hide it, and you go over in the corner of the warehouse and maybe shed a tear and get back to work. That's just the way it was at that time.
What was it that brought you back into a church setting, into a church community?
We left the Methodist Church when Jim and I got together. We were just so frustrated that we just couldn't take some of the terrible things that were being said about gay people, and so we left the Methodist Church and at that time we went to an Episcopal church, did we not? Where gays were accepted, except that Jim was told by one of the board members, one of the older members of the church, that at one point that, well, we tolerate gays, we don't really accept it. Well, we'd been through that. So then, it sounds like we're church hoppers. We really aren't. But then we got involved with the UCC community. That was just a bright spot in our lives. I mean, it was a wonderful place to be. It was wonderful people. The pastor was just so inviting and so loving and so giving, and we really felt a part of that community, a very important part of that community. Then we moved from St. Louis to California, and Jim said, let's go to the Methodist Church, because that's where I was raised. And I said, no. I don't want anything to do with the Methodist Church
Because of your previous experience at the Lafayette Church.
Right. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of it. Well, here we are, and I'm back on a reconciling committee and trying to make a change for the better in the church, and the people here have certainly been loving and giving, and have allowed Jim and I to do what ministries we do without, I don't know, without complaint. I'm sure there are maybe one or two complaints, but most people are just very loving and giving to us. Don't you feel that way, Jim?
I do. I'd like to go back to the 90s when we were first in the Methodist Church, because I experienced at that time a call to ministry, and I talked to the pastor about it. And interestingly, despite the church's official position, I still applied to become a licensed local pastor, which gives you all the authority that an ordained elder has, but you're just sort of limited to the congregation to which you're assigned to be the pastor. And the bishop was fine with it. She knew me. We had talked. She knew that my agenda was the gospel, not gay issues. And so I served the church for a time as a licensed local pastor, and it didn't become a problem. It was the elephant in the room that everybody knew, the congregation knew, but nobody talked about it, so that we could just be a congregation. And then some new people came, and they found out, and then they wanted to make me, in a way, a celebrity, that they had a gay pastor, and wouldn't that be something to, have it be notarized, or not notarized, but notorious perhaps. So anyway, At that point, I turned in my license because the focus of my ministry would have to change. But I was, not long after that, hired to work in the district office of the Methodist Church in St. Louis. So I was still able to serve the church full time. And the district superintendents that I worked for, all of them were very supportive. You know, they said, if anybody gives you any trouble from the churches, let us know. We'll take care of it. So I have to say that behind the scenes, I had a lot of support as an employee of the church. My relationship with Richard was supported, but it was all unseen. People couldn't be or wouldn't be public about it, and that was disappointing. It was always the elephant in the room. I still am in touch with a lot of those people since I retired in 2012, and they are becoming more open, but the church is still so divided, and that is really a disappointment. And when we have annual or general conference in 2016, I don't think that the church is going to change much. I think it will still remain divided on the issue of the full inclusion of the LGBT community. And that's been some of the discussions I've been having of late. And what we hear often is, well, you need to be patient. It'll come. And our response is, we've been patient for 40 years. And then in the last couple of weeks, someone said, well, I think in another 20 years, we'll have the inclusion that we're all hoping that will come. And my response is, I'll be 90 years old in 20 years. So if I'm still here, that's just too long. It's one of those feelings like I'm done with it, but I'm not done with it. You know, I want to leave and just leave all this behind, but I don't want to leave it.
Yeah.
So it gets very frustrating, and sometimes you get pretty angry, and this has been one of those angry weeks.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to explore that a little bit more, but I'd like to go back just a little bit longer, but before, and ask, so would you say that for both of you, it would be true to say that what brought you back to the church was at least from a local congregation, a certain amount of acceptance and openness to who you were, not feeling like you had to hide anything, but as you got further into maybe that local context or even the denominational context, that acceptance only went so far?
I think that's a true statement. We both needed community. That's just who we are. We found it in that congregation. We found acceptance in that congregation. We were no longer two gay guys. We were just another couple. It was Jim and Richard, or Richard and Jim. Didn't matter. There was that acceptance, and I think that's what enabled us to become involved again in the life of the church, very involved in ministry and in the AIDS task force, in my pastoring a couple of churches, because we had that support. But it was just the frustration that people couldn't be public about it. For example, there was the possibility that I was going to get a church full time. At the time, the bishop required the pastors to live in a parsonage if the church owned one. This church owned a parsonage. And I said, and the congregation had no problem with me being their full-time pastor. And they had no problem with Richard living in the parsonage with me. But the higher-ups in the district superintendent and the bishop thought that just was too much. And so I said, well, then I won't accept that appointment. So they gave me a little congregation of little old ladies that, were still hanging on, and that was fine. They were a wonderful group, a very accepting group, and we had a great time, and we did some good ministry with people that were really kind of marginalized because of their age. But the church just couldn't go there at the time. And so it's been a big change to come to California, where in this conference, there are ordained gay people who are openly gay, and it's not the issue that it is elsewhere. But this conference is not the entire Methodist Church, and that's what we hope will change.
Richard, how about you? Would you say that was true? And what were some of the roadblocks you hit?
When Jim was offered the church and then was denied the church because he would have to live in the parsonage and I couldn't live with him, that was something that cut to my core, because not only did they know Jim, they knew who I was. I had met and had even broken bread with them. And it's still, well, we just can't do that. There were so many times that we had friends that were in the, friends in the conference, and different district superintendents, and we had friends who would say, geez, you guys are great. I really support you guys, but I just can't come out publicly because I'm too close to retirement. Wow. Uh, what do you say to that? Well, there's a lot of things I could have said, but but I was talking with church people, so I didn't want to say that.
When we got our application for a marriage license, I wanted the superintendent that I worked for at the time to sign the form. I just thought it would be a neat thing. We had a pretty good working relationship. And then the form would go to the recorder of a county in Iowa and be stamped and filed away forever. But she was so worried about rules and regulations that she would not even just sign her name on a form that nobody was ever going to see again, because she was afraid that it might affect her position as she got close to retirement. And so she said, well, my husband could sign it, but I don't think I should sign it. And I said, that's okay. I'll get someone else to sign it. And I did, a pastor of UCC Church where we had started going. So it was that kind of, needless terror on their part that we don't dare do anything that's any kind of evidence of open support for you as a gay person. We'll just say that we do.
But you're a wonderful person.
Yes. So that gets old. Wears thin.
Wow. Yeah, I can imagine, especially in a Christian context, when you take in the fact that Jesus said, no greater love than this, than a man lay down his life for a friend, and not even willing to lay down a little bit of risk for that career. Wow.
Well,
Can't
and
imagine
when Jim came to me and said, she won't sign it, but she'll have her husband sign it, my comment was like hell. Sorry, but no.
Oh, Richard, not you.
Not I know. I'm sorry. Those slip out occasionally.
Well, before we kind of, because I want to explore a little bit of what the Reconciling Ministries is within the United Methodists, and your involvement and your hope for that. Before that, I really want to kind of get your story. So tell us how you met. How did Jim and Richard come to be?
Go ahead, Jim. You
Okay.
love telling this story.
Well, I showed up at the church on a given Sunday. As it happened, the priest had suggested Lafayette Park Church, and I knew someone, a gay man, who had started going there, and his whole personality had changed for the better. And I thought, if this church can have that kind of influence on his personality, it must be a pretty good place. So I went, and Richard was there, and we met, and it was sort of like, oh, nice to see you, and it was sort of indifferent. But we discovered that we both lived in the same apartment complex. So we'd start to have dinner, and every once in a while I'd go out on a date, and one thing led to another, and then we were doing laundry together and having soup and sandwiches together. And finally we decided, instead of going back and forth from one apartment to the other to have dinner or whatever, we just move in together. So we bought a condo, and that was that.
23 plus years later, we're still together.
And you two are officially married.
We are officially married, have been married for 3 years.
And how did that process come about? Like how difficult or how easy? I'm assuming it wasn't very easy, but
it was not difficult.
Oh, okay.
I woke up one morning and said, I think we should get married. Well, Richard's not a morning person, and so he was like, what? And I said, I think we should get married. I knew 2 women who had gotten married in Iowa, so I contacted them, asked who that minister was. It was a UCC minister in Burlington, Iowa. All I had to do was apply together. We applied for a marriage license in Iowa. They marry people from out of state. Got the form filled out and signed and everything that was required, and sent along the fee with it. They told us when the paperwork was ready. We went to Burlington, Iowa, with a Methodist pastor and her husband. They were our witnesses. And we went to the courthouse, got to the paperwork, went over to the church, had the ceremony, and that was it. It was not at all difficult. When we got to the courthouse, we didn't know what to expect. gave the lady our names. She pulled out the paper, says, "Here it is. Be sure and have the minister sign it." We were in and out of there in 5 minutes.
Wow.
So we went, we were married, had lunch at a French restaurant, and headed home.
The church was great in that we didn't think about cameras or photographs or anything. There was just the four of us going to be there anyway. But the pastor called a parishioner of hers and said, come over here, bring the camera. I'm having a wedding. We need pictures. So we have a whole album of our wedding from the church. They gave us to it.
Nice.
Gave it to us for a gift. So yeah, it was very nice.
It just was not difficult.
And what so many people say, well, what difference does it make whether you're married, whether you have that piece of paper? It does make a difference. We talked about that afterward, and we said, it bonds your relationship. It makes you look at life and love and your relationship and giving and forgiving differently, and I just believe that everybody should have that.
We had been to an attorney almost 20 years before, and he had set up all kinds of paperwork so that we were all but married in terms of legal connection. But to be able to go into a church and stand before the altar, especially with our own backgrounds, religious backgrounds, to be able to stand in front of the altar and have an ordained clergy person marry you, it bonded us the way we have always wanted to be bonded.
And we kissed in the church. It was wonderful. Yeah.
Scandalous.
I know.
Twice.
I'm surprised it hasn't burned down by now, but it's still there.
That was closure in bringing our relationship together. We were committed long before that for all of our lives, but that sealed it and just made it.
So for you two, what are the misconceptions within Christianity? What are the arguments against who you are that are so frustrating and that you feel are either the most hurtful or just the most inaccurate?
I think I go back to the last general conference when on the floor of the general conference, homosexuality was compared with bestiality and all those other alities, which that's just so, I'm sorry, so wacky. That kind of thing and always being looked at as less than. Jim was having a conversation with someone via Facebook, and the pastor who was a very nice guy, one of his remarks was, well, be patient with us in the church. Be patient with us. Okay, so here we have another us and them. We're us, you're them.
Wow.
My big frustration is that there is so much emphasis in resentment because of sex, and it's like people look at a gay person and they see the issue as being sex, and there is so much to any person that has nothing to do with sex. And the older you get, and after a couple of surgeries, there may not be a lot of sex at all, So there's just so much about who we are, our likes, our dislikes, that are no different than anybody else's. We're not predatory old men or anything like that. We love the church, we love God, we consider ourselves Christians, and we pay taxes, and we have bills, and we have gas, and everything else just like everyone else, So there really is no difference between any two people who love each other. No difference between Richard and I and you and your wife, And people just have a problem with that, and I just don't see it.
I'm reminded of a story of a gay couple were being interviewed, and the fellow just couldn't get off the sex part. He was just so concerned about the sex, and so he said. So the one fellow said to the interviewer, "So you really want to know what happens in our bed, don't you?" And the interviewer said, well, he said, well, I can tell you, we've been together 20 years. You want to know what we do in bed? We sleep just like every other couple that's been together 20 years. So there you have it.
So,
Yeah.
so what do you two say to Christians who say, well, how can you call yourself a Christian when the Bible clearly says that what you do is a sin? What is your response to that?
My response is to examine yourself and then question me.
I tell people that they're taking the Bible too literally, that they aren't looking at the Bible in the context it was written in. And I remind them that the Bible really wasn't written for us today. It was written for people a long time ago. And some people think about that, and others just flatly reject it because of their own personal religious beliefs. I don't think that book was written for us. It was written at a different time for different situations. We use it, and it's a wonderful book to live by and to use as an example for the way we should conduct ourselves in our relationships and everything else. But I don't take that book literally.
I take exception with people who decide that gay people don't know God. They need to know God. They need to know Jesus. I'm telling you, when I was going through my first partner's illness, through the AIDS, and saw so many friends die, and he died, my partner died before my eyes in my home. If it weren't for God, if it weren't for or maybe Jesus's partnership with me, I would not be here today. And I know that. I know that grace, I know that comfort that can come. So please don't question whether I know God or I know Jesus. I was reading something this morning on Facebook as a Catholic fellow was talking about who is gay, was talking about his relationship with the church, and he said, all these names that were called, all these, homosexual, queer, sodomites, whatever. He said, you can call me whatever you want, but my deepest identity is and will always be a child of God.
That's good. Wow. So for the both of you, we've mentioned so far the reconciling ministry within the United Methodist. So tell us a little bit about that, and then kind of transitioning into why still be a part of the church. And I'm sure you have days where you're like, I don't know the answer to that question. Because clearly, I mean, anyone sitting down and listening to this right now that would doubt either of your faith in God and Jesus and your passion for that aspect of your life, has issues, that they could listen to you and doubt that. And a lot of people have chosen, I don't need anything to do with the church. I have my faith. I have this. So why still be here?
The reconciling ministries have long fought, and that's the word to use, fought for the full inclusion of gay, lesbian, and transgendered people in the church. And it continues today, and I think that's a wonderful thing to keep fighting for. And in our own church, we've identified ourselves as a reconciling congregation, which means that anyone is welcome here, regardless of sexual orientation or any other thing. This is a safe place for them. That's really, in a nutshell, what being a reconciling congregation is all about. There are also educational aspects, educating the congregation about all the many different ways we can be inclusive and be welcoming, and how we identify ourselves to the community to be welcoming. And I support that. But as an individual, after a while, when you keep beating your head against the wall, there are some days or weeks like this one where you just think, why the hell am I still doing this? It's just not worth it.
Most days, Jim and I are on the same page. Other days, he's up, I'm down. Next day, I'm up, he's down. So we kind of support each other in that, in the struggle, and it is a struggle. I mean, it's a struggle, and it's a struggle to keep looking forward and to keep hoping. I really try not to read any of the negative things that the African churches and people in our own country say about gays and lesbians. It's not a head in the sand thing. I just have heard it for 40 years. And like Jim said, in another 40 years, I'll be 107. So I won't care probably. I will have gone on to some type of glory.
So when you say the African churches, explain to me what you mean by that. Is the United Methodist being an international denomination?
Yes, and in Africa, not every country in Africa, not every person in Africa, but homosexuality it's number one, it's illegal. It's punishable by death in some countries. It's just not the thing to be. So now, since we're a global church and the church is growing so fast in those countries, given their stance on homosexuality, it looks very bleak to us in this country for anything to change in the church.
So worldwide, the growing segments of the United Methodists are the ones that are preventing this from being fully accepted by the denomination?
At the last general conference, I think that if there had been a vote to be fully inclusive, if it had only been the delegates from the United States, in all likelihood that would have passed. But because we are international and because the delegates from outside the United States are by and large evangelical and conservative on this issue, that's why the vote doesn't pass, because we all vote together. And so the issue doesn't pass. And I think that people are going to become more vocal this next year. It's going to be an election year, and the conservatives movements, I think, are going to be more vocal. And that, coupled with the international delegates who are by and large conservative in their voting, personally, if I had to bet on it, I wouldn't bet for the church becoming more progressive and more inclusive than it is now. I think it might even go the other way.
So what does a local congregation do if they want to be a part of Reconciling Ministries? Do they just throw up a rainbow on their sign and change their mission statement? Or what are the steps that being involved in the Reconciling Committee and making changes in a church, what are the things that a church needs to do for someone who is part of the LGBT community to feel fully accepted?
Oh my goodness. Go on the web to RMN Network, and it tells you all about the Reconciling Ministries Network. There's different segments for gays and lesbians, for transgender, bisexual. Of course, we include everybody. There's a place where you can find a church in your area who is a reconciling congregation, and start from there and talk with the reconciling congregation, the committee leader in those churches. And they have programs that help churches in the process. Kind of a what to say to this question, what to say to that question, how to make yourselves visible as reconciling congregation. And I want to say, affirmation and reconciling congregations started out, and still is, about the acceptance of gays and lesbians in the church and full ordination and that type of thing. But reconciliation, for me, also means bringing all people into our churches. You know, we have churches that are so segregated, so averse to the other coming in our doors, and that's not church to me. Church is everybody, the whole wide world. But yes, if somebody wants to talk about becoming a reconciling congregation or a reconciling individual, that is also an option. Just go to RMN Network. I believe it's .org.com.
We'll put the link in the show notes for this.
Great. So yeah, and please do, and please, as I'm saying today, just hang in there. Jim is saying he's done, but
it might change tomorrow,
but
right?
Tomorrow it will change.
It might change tomorrow.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is, we've kind of beat up on the United Methodist Church in general, but we belong to a reconciling congregation, and it needs to be said that the fact that we're gay men at our own local church just is not an issue. It's Jim and Richard, husband and husband, and it's just no issue. And I think that there are probably a few people who were uncomfortable with the fact that we came here, maybe uncomfortable with the fact that the congregation became a reconciling congregation. What does that mean? But as they have gotten to know us, and we put a face on the gay community to our congregation, we look pretty much just like everybody else. It's a good way for incrementally for the church to change. It's while we will have general conference and there will be a vote and there will be an outcome, the way the church is going to change is going to be one congregation at a time, and that is going to take a long time to change. And probably we should be patient, but not this week.
So for you two in a local congregation, what are the parameters for you to say this is an accepting church? Obviously, there's probably a lot of things, like I mentioned before, the mission statement, or if there's a rainbow outside or whatever. But when you actually encounter the congregation, for instance, like what made you stay here? What was it? What does a church need to do to really make someone feel that they're genuinely accepted? A local congregation.
Just accept. Don't judge. Just accept. I'm brought to mind Mona's conversation with her friend about racism.
Yeah.
About how she felt like people sometimes made her, this is my black friend, how exotic she is. Don't make us exotic. Make us your friend. Make us your friend.
If there were a camera, they wouldn't.
Make us the member. I talk with my hands, Jim's referring to that. But just make us friends or not.
And I think that was it about our current church. I was coming back to the church that I first became a Methodist in. And, there's a certain hesitancy the first time you come in, even though the minister said, you're going to be welcome here. Are we going to be welcome? So I would say, hi, Jim Wagner, and this is my spouse, Richard. And everybody that I did that to, that was a test on my part. I wanted to see what kind of a reaction we would get. And I don't know of anyone who made any reaction other than, oh, well, I'm glad to meet you, and we're glad you're here.
You mean there was no music in the background saying, dun, dun, dun?
No, there wasn't. So that's how you know you're accepted. And I think when you're used to being discriminated against or expecting to be discriminated against, you're really on the lookout for any little nuance or innuendo that might suggest any kind of resentment or concern about you being there. Just have not experienced that in the church we're in. We're just Jim and Richard.
That's great.
It is.
So, final question. What do you want to see and hope to see in this year, at least at General Council, but just in general? What is your hope for the church, and what do you think the church's function is supposed to be, and where's it missing the mark?
Well, the hope would be that the church would become fully inclusive. That's not going to happen. I think as a reality, I don't think it will ever happen, just because human animals are who they are, and theology is what it is. And the spectrum in the Methodist Church theologically is so broad that I don't honestly believe, and I don't say that in an accusatory way, I just don't think that the church can ever become of one mind on the issue. So then they have to decide how they're going to handle it. Does the church stop being, in its polity, a unity type thing, or do they allow conferences and congregations more latitude? Or in some fashion, does the denomination split into a conservative and a progressive? I have hope, but I don't think it'll be realized the way I would hope for it. I think that the issue is too large and the church is too large for it to happen.
And I agree with Jim. My vision would be for the church to be a united Methodist church, and everybody is welcome. Unfortunately, at this point, I don't see that happening in my lifetime. I don't want to say that I call for schism, but I think that probably would be the best way to go for our jurisdiction and our churches, and whoever is out there who wants to be a reconciling church. Let those churches be reconciling. If we have to split it down the middle, oh my God, I'm calling for schism on the airwaves. But unfortunately, I've come to see that that's probably the only way we will ever have peace, if you will, in the church.
Well, hopefully a schism or a split is just a temporary means to something that's more unified in the future. But in the meantime, I can't tell you guys, and I told you this individually, but appreciate you guys so much for what you do in this church and the friendship that we've developed. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast and doing this interview. I have a feeling that people are going to have their eyes opened with just your story and your heart and your passion and your faith and everything that you guys put forward, knowing that some days are good and some days are bad, but still on that path and moving forward. So thank you so much for being a part of this and being fans of the show enough to come on and put yourself out there a little bit.
You're welcome, and we appreciate you too.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think that'll do it for us this week. We will have in the show notes links to the reconciling ministries within the United Methodist Church. If you are a part of the UMC, or even if you just want tips on your own local church on things you can do to be more accepting and more open to those in the LGBT community, or just in general, like Richard said, just all inclusive and really helping people become what God has created them to be and bear that image in a way that is loving and accepting for all that they come in contact with. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this interview, and we hope that this series on gender and sexuality has been helpful for you to have a new perspective, or at the very least, just understanding that there's a difference between the issue and the person. It's people that matter and their stories. Thank you once again, and we'll see you next week.